Well, welcome everyone to today's New York Times Speaker Series. Today we're featuring Carlos Lozada. He's a journalist from the New York Times, and his session is on defining moments, building a career in political journalism. My name is Janeri Mendoza-Farjan, and I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. And I have here with me our team. So our Assistant Vice President is here with us, Dr. Hilary Landorf. Also, we have Connie Penchak assisting us in the Zoom room in the back. And Roji, our graduate assistant, is also here in the floor. And Agustina, our student intern. You also met Michelle and Rola. They're also part of our team, and they will be in the lobby as well to assist with any questions that you may have. Just as a reminder for everyone, if you haven't scanned your QR code, I'm so sorry, I forgot one very important person, Greg Anderson, our Senior Program Coordinator. Thank you so much for being here with us. So as a reminder, just scan the QR code in the screen if you haven't done so already. This is how we're going to capture your attendance for today. For those students that are coming for extra credit from your professor, or the Global Learning Medallion points, Honors College engagement points. But we're also happy to have the rest of the FIU community with us, faculty, administrators, and staff. Thank you so much for joining us today. Also, we're going to have a little bit of time at the end for questions for our presenters. So if you happen to have a question, we just ask you to get closer to the microphones. There are 2 microphones in the area, so we can capture your question in the recording as well. Our office has a couple of programs available for all undergraduate students. We have the Global Learning Medallion Program, Peace Corps Prep, and also scholarships and fellowships. If you would like to learn more about our programs, you may visit goglobal.fiu.edu/students, or scan also the QR code to take you to our Instagram page. All right, and also all Tuesday Times Roundtables are always connected to a news article. Today's session, the New York Times Speaker Series, is part of the lineup. This happens every semester where we have weekly talks about global issues and trends. Today's session is going to be linked to Carlos' news page, so you may go to go.fiu.edu/TTR0414 to access his page. And then this is also because of the formal partnership that FIU has with the New York Times that provides everyone with digital access to the New York Times. So if you would like to activate your account with your FIU email address, you may go to accessnyt.com. Also, we connect the sessions to the Sustainable Development Goals. Today's session is connected to SDG number 17, Partnerships for the Goals, by strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnerships for sustainable development. All right, and now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hilary Landorf. She is going to be introducing today's presenters, Carlos Lozada. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hilary Landorf, Assistant Vice President for the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, and also the founding member of the Office of Global Learning at FIU.
Thank you, Janeri, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I have the honor of introducing you to our speaker, Carlos Lozada. Carlos is an opinion columnist at the New York Times and winner of the Pulitzer Prize for criticism. He's a prolific writer of nonfiction, and his latest book is the Washington book, How to Read Politics and Politicians. Previously, he was a senior editor and book critic at the Washington Post and the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine. And in 2024, he was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has a background in economics, having worked as a managing editor for foreign policy and at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Carlos is not your typical journalist. He's an opinion writer, For his articles, he doesn't go into the field and interview people or give first-person direct accounts of events going on the street. Instead, he explores issues by engaging in close reading and analysis, exploring how issues and people's characters, our inner characters, are revealed through writing. Carlos has always applied the best of global learning to his writing. In each of his columns, he's an active reader of other people's writing and of current and past events, trying to capture the world as it is, knowing when to connect the dots from the past to present and when not to, all in the service of trying to understand the world we live in and convey these attempts at understanding to us, his readers. This kind of work takes a most generous, open, analytical person, someone who can hold the local and the global, the individual and the collective in their head and in their heart at the same time. This person is very special, and his name is Carlos Lozada. So please join me in welcoming Carlos as he shares his reflections on the defining moments that shaped his own path in political journalism.
Thank you, Dr. Landorf, and thanks to FIU for inviting me here. Thanks to all of you for coming. I live in Washington, but I have strong personal ties to FIU. I have a sister who earned undergraduate and graduate degrees here at FIU. My niece earned an undergraduate degree here, and my other sister, Rosie, teaches at the law school here. So it's very exciting for me to join this community, even just for today and tomorrow. And I'm happy to share some thoughts about my 25 years working as a journalist in Washington. But before getting to Washington or to journalism, I want to return for a moment to my high school days. When I was 15 years old, growing up in Lima, Peru, I took a vocational test in school. And I'm sure some of you have taken these kind of tests before. The idea was to figure out what my classmates and I liked to do in the hope that then we could figure out what we were meant to do. I'd forgotten entirely about this test in the decades since, until my mother, who's also here today, and is a dedicated scavenger of our childhood relics, found the copy of the test results recently and sent it to me. And looking at this now was fascinating for me. My vocation, it seems, was not in the realm of mathematics or science, where I scored just in the mid-ranges of interest. My mechanical and engineering interests were so low that they didn't even register on the test. It was just a flat line. And my wife and kids bring this up whenever I try and fail to do repair work around the house. Music and social services were of minimal appeal to me. And weirdly, I didn't want to work in an office or outdoors. I just didn't want to work anywhere when I was 15 years old. But there were two arenas that did stand out, according to this test. I had high literary interests, which the report explained. It meant that I liked to read and express myself in writing. I also scored high for persuasive interests, meaning that I was someone who liked to impose his point of view and influence the opinion of others. And then, very conveniently, the test tells you what this adds up to for your career. It said I should be an author, or a professor, or a journalist. So I didn't ace this test, but the test completely aced me. Throughout my professional life, I've worked as an editor, as a book critic, as an author, and now as a columnist. And when I was looking at this, I thought maybe if I just paid attention to this test at the very beginning, I might have embarked on my career in journalism right away. But I didn't, not even close. And I like my job, and I like the career that I've eventually come to. But I'm so glad that I took the scenic route to getting there. The title of this talk today is about how I've built a career in political journalism, building a career in political journalism. And that verb build feels very deliberate and methodical, right? As if I meant to do that all along, as if I had a blueprint in mind. Decades ago, when I was a student, as if I aspire then to be a journalist and to eventually work at the New York Times. And I assure you that I didn't. I had very different plans. And looking back on my work life, on my career, I see that I remade those plans on multiple occasions, sometimes not even knowing that that's what I was doing, right? Sometimes I got bored, or I got insecure about my work, or just curious. And so I made a change, one that might have seemed big or that might have seemed minor. And those moments add up to a career, but one you can only make sense of in hindsight. There's all these metaphors and images we use about careers, and I think they're almost all misleading. They all presuppose that you know where you're going, right? You're climbing the ladder. You're walking a path. You're getting on the fast track, right? Even the rat race, if people still say that, has a sense of direction to it, right? But I don't think that's how it works. That's not how it's worked for me. A career I've discovered, the best image I can think of is it's like driving a car, but only by looking in the rearview mirror, right? That seems weird and definitely unsafe. No one should do that. But the reason I think of my career that way is that it's only by looking back that you can see how A led to B, led to C, led to now, and which twists and turns were most significant. So I'm going to share that story for me of my career and highlight 3 moments that when I look back, I realize were very important for me. Like I said, I didn't plan on being a journalist. The journalists I know have all wanted to do this from like their time in the womb, you know? Like this is what they were put on earth to do. They like broke news on their like middle school principal, you know, and edited their high school paper. You know, this is what they're devoted to. You take them out of a newsroom and they shrivel up and die, right? I wasn't like that. At first, I wanted to be a policy wonk. I studied economics and political science in college. I got a master's degree in public policy, and I went to work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. The Fed, you know, the central bank of the United States, sets interest rates and is involved in regulating the banking system. An uncle of mine, a man who I greatly admired, had been involved in that kind of work in Peru, in the central bank and in the finance ministry. And I wanted to be like him. So this is what I did. And I set myself on that path. The Federal Reserve was a great place to work. I was an analyst in their research department, and our job was to put together reports on national and international economic conditions for the bank president. I felt like I was making a contribution to the world, to the United States. I was putting my academic skills to good use. It was a stable and reasonably well-paying job. This was decades before Doge. So working for the government felt like a very stable thing, a place to build a career, right? That word again, building. Back then I thought building a career meant working at one place for a long time. Also, it was a real job, the kind my parents could be excited about. I wore a tie to work. I was in my mid to late 20s and I thought like, okay, I've got this figured out. But there was one problem with that job. I was bored. I was bored to death. I worked with really nice people, but I felt that I wasn't putting anything of myself into this work. You could plug anyone else in with a similar sort of set of technical skills and they'd churn out the same reports that I was producing. I wanted to do something that felt a little bit more distinctive, something that, in a burst of ego that, only I could do, right? And also as I looked around in the Fed, I saw colleagues who'd been there 10, 20, 30 years, right? It was a very comfortable place to be. And I panicked. I could see myself getting sucked into that same life, and I wasn't ready to make that commitment. But making a change feels risky. The job I had, it was a little boring, but it was safe, right? I did not come from great wealth, and here I was, like putting money in a retirement account, paying off student loans. This was good, right? So why should I give up on this plan? Was it worth it to try something different? I decided to try, not for any kind of like grand or noble reason, but because I could at the time. I was single, didn't have a family to support. If I was going to take a risk, this was the right time to do it. This became my first, quote unquote, defining moment, the first pivot that I made. It was probably the clearest and sharpest one that I made. I wanted to get away from the Fed and get away from economics. The problem is I wasn't sure what I was pivoting toward. Right? All I knew is I wanted to do something different, something more creative. And I know how vague and pretentious, being creative can sound. I had a romanticized idea of journalism and of writing. I'd always been a pretty voracious consumer of journalism and follower of news, and also a pretty dedicated reader. And I thought, what if I do that, right? Can I find something in that world? So I didn't quit my job, but I spent all my free time trying to find a new job. Where can I apply for a job? Where can someone take someone with no real qualifications for this field they're trying to enter? Lots of false starts, lots of blind alleys. And I didn't have what all these kids who had been doing journalism forever did. Lots of clips, lots of things they can show about like how they had done it. What I did have, though, that most of them didn't, was this background in economics, right? And when I finally got a job at Foreign Policy magazine, it was because they wanted an editor there who could do a better job than they were doing of covering international economics and trade and globalization and those kinds of issues. This was the early 2000s. And I had those skills. They figured it was easier to take someone with a background in economics and teach him how to be an editor than to find someone with editing skills and teach him economics, right? So this is where I learned something really crucial that has served me in good stead. The world I was trying to get away from became my magic key into the world I was trying to enter, right? Everything you learn in life and school is useful in ways you don't know at the time, you don't imagine. Even if you feel you're not going to use it ever again, you're trying to make a break from it, it's something you always have in your back pocket. I think my parents were slightly concerned that I was leaving the security of the Federal Reserve for a job in journalism, and also taking a pay cut in the process. Also, in Peru, where we're from, journalism is not always the most reputable profession, not like being a lawyer or a banker, right? So that didn't really help either. But I assured them, and I mostly meant it, that I would try it for a couple of years, and if it didn't work out, I could always go back to this kind of life. But I knew I didn't want to go back. So I worked as hard as I could at the new place. I spent 5 years at Foreign Policy magazine. I learned a ton from really good colleagues. Whenever you're interviewing for a job, if you encounter really smart people who work there that you can learn from, that's a really good sign. If you don't see those people there, run away. This was a magazine that covered global economics and international politics and big debates about war and trade and globalization. It's also a small magazine, and when you work at a small place, you learn to do almost everything. I learned how to edit an article and sharpen an argument. I learned how to take academic writing and translate it for a more general audience. I learned how to persuade writers to better express their own ideas and to embrace the consequences and the logic of their own arguments. And as smarter people moved up and moved on from the magazine, I was able to take on more responsibilities. Eventually, I became the managing editor of the magazine, meaning the number 2 editor under the editor-in-chief who had hired me. After about 5 years, I decided it was time to move on. Not because it had been 5 years. I often hear someone say, like, oh, I'll work there for 2 years or for 5 years or for this, as if there's something magical about a number of years. The time to move on is when you've stopped learning, not when you've reached some arbitrary timeline. When you know that it's time to add to your skills someplace else. I learned just about everything I was going to learn at Foreign Policy, and when you're not learning anymore, you're just wasting your time. So what to do next? I was living in Washington, D.C., working in journalism. I'd met some people who worked at the Washington Post, so I decided to try my luck there. I felt utterly unqualified to work at the almighty Washington Post, so it was almost scary to apply for an editing job there. But if you don't feel a little underqualified for whatever job you're applying to, it's probably the wrong job to apply to. If it looks too easy, you're not going to learn much and you shouldn't be there. I didn't get that first job, which was disappointing, but I did manage to make it somewhat deep into the interview process. So I met lots of folks there, and we finished things off on good terms, even though I didn't get the job. Always make sure you leave that door a little open, even when you're crushed and disappointed about not getting a job, because you don't know when it's going to swing back open again. A year later, it did for me. They had another opening for an editor at the Post, and they thought of me. I interviewed again. This time they hired me, and guess what the job was? It was to be their economics editor, right? So again, this thing that I didn't want to do anymore kept helping me find new opportunities. As economics editor, I was overseeing our coverage of international trade, of the domestic and global economy, and of the Federal Reserve, which I could legitimately say I knew something about. I took a lot of editing jobs at the Washington Post. Thanks to what I learned at Foreign Policy Magazine, I became the national security editor at the Post as well. You see how the skills and tools you gather just start adding up to new opportunities. I moved around the newsroom a lot in 10 years. I also edited our coverage of the White House and our Weekend Opinion section. And I thought, okay, I'm building, again that word, I'm building a career as an editor at the Washington Post. I was never bored at the Post like I had been at the Federal Reserve, but I was becoming a little insecure. The regular sequence in journalism is that first you're a writer, and then if you show certain skills, you become an editor, which means you manage other writers. You manage teams of writers. I'd done it backwards. I'd been an editor first. And here I was, running these great teams of reporters at the Washington Post, never having done much writing myself. And it was starting to weigh on me. I felt like I would never be credible, fully credible as an editor, as a journalist, unless I put myself out there, did my own writing, had my own byline on stories. This became my second defining moment, even though I stayed in the same organization. I figured if I wanted to be a real journalist, I would have to write. I was wondering how to make that transition. I didn't want to report on economics or national security. I wanted to make a change, to try something different from me, thinking back to what can I put my imprint on? What is something that is uniquely mine? And just as I was pondering all this, the longtime book critic at the Washington Post, who had been in the job for more than 30 years, announced he was retiring. And I knew, I want to try that. That's what I need to do. Now, newspapers, actually this is a lot less now than it used to be, but newspapers used to have, music critics and book critics and movie critics and restaurant critics and theater critics, and they're great jobs. When you're a food critic, you get to go to great restaurants. When you're a music critic, you get to go to cool concerts. When you're a theater critic, you get to go to see great plays. All a book critic gets is the books a couple of months early. That's it. There's no other fringe benefit. You get them maybe a month or two before they're available to the public. So at the Post, we had a fiction critic who covered novels, but also a nonfiction critic, and that's the guy who was retiring. He was responsible for writing reviews on politics and history and memoir and economics and current events. And immediately I knew this was something I wanted to try. Writing about books just seemed like a dream job to me. My bosses, the editors at the Post, the top editors, completely disagreed. They thought it was a terrible idea, career suicide, a detour away from this path I was on, the editing track. I was like, the next job should be to edit a bigger team. And you'll realize bosses in your workplaces will often want you to follow the path they followed because it validates their career choices, right? Not because it's necessarily right for you. Don't fall for that, right? I dug my heels in and made my case. This is what I want to do. Eventually they relented and let me do it. I told them, just like I told my parents years earlier, I might do this for a year or two. If it doesn't work out, I'll go back to editing. And now it's been about 12 years and counting that I'm writing. And being a writer instead of being an editor, even though it may seem like a minor thing within journalism, ended up being a really significant shift for me. I realized then, only in hindsight, only looking back in that rearview mirror, that everything I had done, working in economic policy, editing coverage of economics, of international trade, of national security, all that was actually great preparation to be the nonfiction book critic at the Washington Post, where I'd have to review books on all those topics and pretend to write intelligently, semi-intelligently about a lot of different things. Again, this only made sense after the fact. And so now I'm in my early 40s, not now, I wish, but at this moment I was in my early 40s, and somehow I was a writer and a literary critic. And if you told me 20 years before that, when I was in college, that, when you're in your 40s, you're gonna be a literary critic at a major American paper, I would have changed everything. I would have become an English major, tried to get an MFA or something like that, maybe gone to get an advanced degree in creative writing. I never would have studied economics and political science, public policy, and gone to work for the Federal Reserve, right? That would have been insane. But that's the way it worked out, right? You can't game out life. You can't plan it all out and then execute that plan. It's only in hindsight that you see how A leads to B leads to C. It turns out my vocation was to be a book critic with a background in economic policy and foreign policy journalism. Right? To the extent that I've been able to do anything distinctive as a journalist, I think it's probably what I accomplished as a book critic. Most book critics read maybe one book a week and review that one book. And it's always a new book. It's always whatever the latest book the publishing houses are churning out. And I did that in my first year in that job because I wanted everyone to know, like, I'm the guy doing this now. So I tried to review as many books as I could. But soon I realized that I didn't want to be hostage to whatever the publishers were putting out. Right? I wanted to try to set my own agenda for what I wanted to write about. And so I decided that I would just pick a subject that I cared about, and then I would find a lot of books, new and old, that somehow spoke to it, and take the time to read them, and just dive into them, and hopefully come up for air with something that was worth holding up to the light. So I started writing a bit less frequently, but when I did, it was more these deep dives, these longer essays, and it turns out readers really responded to those. Even though I wrote less often, I sort of had more readers as a result of this approach that I was taking. Now, my becoming a book critic coincided in time almost precisely with Donald Trump's first presidential campaign and his time in American politics since then. So I started writing a lot about all the books that were coming out about the Trump presidency. There were hundreds. I mean, if you look at, so a lot of people wrote about Barack Obama, right? Like a lot. He was a big thing in American politics. And I would say there's at least 2 or 3 times the number of books in the equivalent period that have come out about the Trump presidency. Not just books about his policies or his time in the White House, but about all the issues that have defined this period. Books about immigration, books about the white working class, books about democracy, books about Russia, books about the Me Too movement. All the big debates of this time were litigated through books, and I was there to scoop them all up and read about them. This became the basis for a book that I wrote that came out in 2020 called What Were We Thinking? That was about how American writers and intellectuals thought about the Trump presidency in real time. It came out just before the 2020 election. I also tried to expand beyond books in this role. I would read any kind of written material that to me spoke to these issues. So I would write reviews about Supreme Court cases. As a non-lawyer, that's probably a terrible thing for me to do. I write about congressional reports, about special counsel investigations, about blue ribbon commissions on important national debates. It was a job that allowed me to dig into almost anything, which made it a real joy. A friend of mine told me once that the best way to carve out a career in journalism was to define your lane really narrowly, but then exercise it really broadly, right? I'm just a nonfiction book critic, like away in my little corner, but within that, I could write about anything. Like anything I wanted to write about, I could. For the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, I read 20 books that explained different aspects of that day, right? Leading up to the attacks, what happened that day, the wars that followed, the way the country was changed. And the editors gave me the time and space to write like an 8,000-word essay about 9/11 for the 20th anniversary. By this point, they were on board with my doing the job. They were okay with it. I felt like I'd finally reached this goal, right? When I left the Fed, I want to do something creative and something that I can put my imprint on. But again, I never would have planned it this way. So I was a book critic at the Post for 7 years, and I probably would have stayed there till they carried me out in a coffin. I loved working there. The New York Times had come, knocking a few times, and they would always say, like, you'll have a much bigger audience, if you just come over here. And they were right about that. It is a bigger audience, a bigger platform. But I didn't really, I know it sounds crazy, as a journalist you want more people to read you, but I didn't really care about the audience. What I cared about was the freedom I had to do the kind of work I wanted to do. I would always, to this day, trade away audience for freedom, right? Like I want to do the work that I want to do. And I was comfortable at the Post, but not so comfortable that I ever felt like I was getting lazy. The third defining moment is when I left the Washington Post for the New York Times, maybe 3.5 years ago. Unlike the first 2 moments, they were not brought out by some internal impulse. I wasn't bored like at the Fed. I wasn't insecure like when I moved from editing to writing. It was an external impetus. The Post ownership was moving in new directions, and I wasn't sure that the newsroom leaders that they'd appointed were really committed to the kind of work that I wanted to do. They liked me. I'd been around a long time, and I was a good colleague, but I don't think they really wanted me to keep doing long-term the work I was doing. And to me, that was sort of an ultimate red flag. As sad as I was, I knew it was time to leave. It seems silly because the Times is often considered this like kind of destination place, but it was really hard to go there. So much of my professional identity was wrapped up in this one place, what I work now for 17 years, which was the Washington Post. I had lots of close friends there. The Post had been really good to me at some difficult moments in my life. And those things matter enormously. They tell you about the character of an institution. But it turns out in leaving, I was just a couple of years ahead of the curve because there's been a mass exodus from the Washington Post recently as the ownership of the paper has begun making moves that I found a bit erratic and a bit disappointing. The funny thing about joining the Times is that they wanted to hire me as an opinion columnist, which I adamantly did not want to be. I almost had a mental block about just the job title. To me, a columnist seems like this person like leaning back in a chair, or stroking his chin, and like just riffing on whatever was going on, right? Inflicting hot takes on everything, you know? And I didn't want to do that. That's not how I worked at all, right? As a book critic, I tried to read a lot and learn a lot before inflicting my views on anyone. And I didn't have a lot of hot takes ready to fling at everyone. I even asked the Times if they could just call me something else. Could you hire me for a different role, change the title? The label really bothered me. We went round and round until finally one of the bosses at the Times said, look, we can pay you a lot more if we call you a columnist. And suddenly all my concerns just vanished. I was like, you know what, that's fine. I totally get it. What really clinched it is that they understood the way I wanted to work and the kind of work I wanted to do. And they liked it, just wanted to see it in the New York Times. And so I realized the label didn't matter as much as I thought it did, and I took the plunge. It's been great so far. I'm not just saying so because I'm here representing the New York Times. I work with a genius editor and a truly thoughtful research assistant who is going to be a genius editor someday. And I've been able to continue writing about books and written material while delving into other kinds of projects. I co-hosted a podcast for 2 years with other Times columnists called Matter of Opinion. I've been writing a lot about immigration lately as it's become a more significant topic in American politics. I've also developed something of an accidental subspecialty in dissecting the words and phrases of political leaders. I do it a lot with the president, for instance. Like, what does he mean when he says the United States is the hottest country in the world? In what context does he like what's he trying to express with that? When he says the Iran war is ahead of schedule, what does that mean, right? When he got shot in a campaign rally, he stood up and said, "Fight, fight, fight." What did "fight, fight, fight" mean, right? So I've tried to keep things interesting and varied for me, hoping I never get bored like I did at the Fed. Hopefully not too insecure either, like I did at the Washington Post for a while. And the way I got over my sort of mental block about the columnist label is that I've tried to reimagine that role, reimagine how I exercise that role. My columnist colleagues at the Times, and they're great at this, they tend to think of themselves as being in the persuasion business, right? They may be on the left or on the right of an issue, but they try to tell you why something is good and something else is bad, why something is better, why something is worse. I try very hard to not do that, mainly because I get paralyzed by details and nuances sometimes, so it's hard to come down full force on one side of a debate. Also, my own politics are kind of messy. They're not as straightforward or uniform, so I don't have a single ideological lens through which I see everything and evaluate everything. My job would be so much easier if I did. But my philosophy is not to try to tell you what I think or what to think, but in a way just to model a process of thought, right? To take you along for the ride on my own way of thinking through an issue. I hope that's a little bit of what I'm doing here today. These 3 moments that I've highlighted, leaving the Federal Reserve to try my luck in journalism, leaving editing to try my luck as a writer, leaving the Post to try my luck at the Times, have all brought me to this moment in my career where I am right now. Is this the end point of it, the final moment I finally figured out what I meant to do, right? I've come back to the results of my vocational aptitude test. I hope not. A lot of people who become New York Times columnists try to hold on to those jobs forever because they're prestige-y, cushy gigs. But I can imagine easily trying my luck at something new. I hope I still have plenty of life in me. I can imagine pursuing new opportunities down the road, even if I don't know what those opportunities might be. They may not be in journalism at all. It might be that my vocation is actually to do that next thing, but with a background in economic policy and book criticism and column writing. As President Trump often says, when he doesn't have a clear idea of what's coming next, we'll see what happens. I want to wrap up with an anecdote that by now is more than 30 years old, but I still think about a lot. I was a freshman in college, and a kid who lived in my dorm was telling the rest of us how he had his career all figured out. This was maybe 1990. George H.W. Bush, the dad, was president, and Japan looked ready to conquer the world, not militarily, but economically. Right? The Japanese economy was growing super fast. Japanese companies were buying up major American companies like Columbia Pictures, buying up American landmarks like Rockefeller Center. Folks in the United States were really concerned about Japan. And during a state visit, I don't know if you guys remember this, George H.W. Bush got sick and threw up on the lap of the Japanese prime minister, which is not, symbolism, right? Not a good sign. But anyway, this kid in my dorm was telling us how he was going to take advantage of this situation. He was going to major in finance and Japanese, right? And that way he'd be able to do business with Japan, make a lot of money at a young age, super smart. He had it figured out. Except, of course, things did not turn out that way. During the 1990s, what happened to Japan? It fell off a cliff. The economy cratered. The US economy boomed. And if this kid really wanted to make money long term, maybe he should have majored in computer science and Chinese, right? Instead of finance and Japanese. I always think of him when I think about planning out our careers, when I hear people say that finance or computer science or video game design or whatever it is the hot thing that the market really wants right now. And I think of him when I think of how my own career shaped up, and when I talk to students about their career plans, I think of him when they tell me what the smart thing to do is right now. I tell them that you can't game life out ahead of time. You just need to plunge in, be ready to shift, to have these defining moments again and again and again. But here's the thing. I had never looked him up to see what he was up to now. So last week, in preparation for this conversation, I spent way too much time on Facebook. He has kind of a generic name, so it was hard to find him. But I did. And I found him through Facebook. He did complete a finance major. And a language major, but by the time he graduated, he had switched from Japanese to Spanish. He had worked in finance, but no longer. Now he's a race director for triathlons and other road races. And apparently he's been doing this for a long time. He listed his hobbies as swimming, biking, and running, right? Which, of course, are the three legs of triathlon. I was thrilled to see this. I was so happy to find this out, and so happy for him. He had not stuck with the thing that he thought was trendy, when he was 18 or 19 years old. He seemed to have found his own defining moment, pivoting away from finance into this other career that was obviously a passion of his, that seemed to make him happy, certainly seemed healthy. I felt bad for thinking of him as exhibit A of what not to do for so many years, right? But here's the thing. I bet that his background in finance and business and management makes him a very talented race director and manager of athletic events. Everything you learn comes in handy, right? Even in ways you don't expect. I'm sure you've heard the old joke, the old line, if you want to make God laugh, tell him about your plans, right? The idea being that your plans rarely work out the way you think they might, the way you once hoped that they would. My plans have not worked out at all the way I thought they would, and thank God that they didn't. You're getting a wonderful education here at FIU. You should be proud of it, take advantage of it, and don't take it for granted. Everything you learn here will come in handy whether or not you work in the field that you're studying right now. In fact, the best I can hope for you is that from time to time, your plans do not work out at all, and you feel compelled to rethink them and remake them again and again. And then when you look back on your career through that rearview mirror, you and God can just share a good laugh together. Thank you so much. Do I stay here for the questions? Okay.
Have time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, we do have 2 microphones on each side. feel free to come over to connect with Carlos.
I'm gonna.
Hi, I wanted to ask, what would you recommend to improve writing? Right now, I write for the school newspaper, and I want to work on my clarity and just being able to explain well in writing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have two things that come to mind, but journalists always have to explain things in groups of three. So as I'm explaining the first two, I'll try to come up with a third. Yeah, the way journalists count is 1, 2, trend. Yeah. So the first thing, if you want to improve your writing, you need to improve your reading. You need to read voraciously, read all sorts of writing, even if it's not related to the exact kind of writing that you want to do. You'll recognize good writing. I read a lot of like fiction when I can in English and in Spanish. Sometimes you find turns of phrase or ways of expressing things in different languages that are helpful in the one you're writing in. Just reading a lot. Reading. I find that the best writers I know are incredibly dedicated readers. The second thing I would say, and this is hard to do, when you have a draft of like a paper or an article or something you're writing, read it out loud. When you read things out loud, you will find a million mistakes, a million run-on sentences. You will find words that you're repeating multiple times throughout a paragraph. You will notice things that you would never notice when you're reading words on a page. And it takes longer. Sometimes if you dare, read it out loud to another human being, which is also hard. People do not like to do this. But reading your work out loud with a pen in hand will vastly improve what you are saying. Have a few trusted people that you show your writing to. Not all of us are so lucky to have an expert in legal writing as a sibling, but Rosie is perhaps my most dedicated reader and is the first person to read my articles when they post at 5 in the morning and find the one typo in the 87th paragraph, and she can let me know so I can make the change before anyone notices. And so reading and writing feel like solitary things, but there's a communal aspect to them as well that I think is really healthy. So reading extensively, reading your own writing out loud, and is there a third thing to justify the journalistic trend? You know what? I'll just leave it at those two. Those two. But keep at it. That's the other thing I would say, is that there's a lot of people who sort of say they want to be writers, but actually don't do a lot of writing. And you have to be writing every day. You have to take some time every day, whether you feel like it or not, to keep at it, because that's the only way to get better.
I appreciate it.
Sure. Oh, you don't have to clap after every answer, although it's a great ego boost. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I want to go back to your audience. At some point you said, I don't care about my audience. So you must care about audience. I'm sure the New York Times cares about your audience.
Oh, yeah.
And how do you get feedback from your audience, and where does that take you for your next piece, your future work?
Yeah. You're completely right. It's not that I don't care about the audience. It's that the audience can be a fickle mistress. You have to be careful if you focus too much on your audience, because pretty soon you find yourself adjusting your writing just to cater to a certain kind of audience. At the Times, I can pull out my phone there and go to a special internal site that we have that breaks down all the data on every article that I've written. I can tell you how many people have clicked on it, how long on average they stayed on the article, how deep they got into it, where they came from, where they found the article. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It's this magical power. At the Washington Post, they used to have screens on the walls like these that had like the top 15 articles at that moment on our website, how many people were on them, how long. Like I thought that was actually not a particularly healthy
Public shame
habit.
and peer pressure.
Yeah, and so and also you may not know. I didn't know about this until I joined the Times. There's a New York Times on the website. There's nytimes.com/trending, which tells you the top 13 articles on the site at that moment. And boy, do I get an adrenaline boost when my article is there, especially when it's like not like clinging to the end, like at number 12 or something, but like it's number 3 or number 2, right? So there's a natural thing to kind of care about the audience, but you don't, as much detail as we have, I don't really know what those numbers mean sometimes, right? I don't know, are they hate reading me? Are they love reading me, Are they just reading me because the editor thought of a really brilliant headline for the article that day? By the way, I really don't like New York Times headlines. I think, but there's this like magical team that like tests different headlines and figures out which ones do best, and those are the headlines that stay on the article. I used to put headlines on my own articles, and I was at the Washington Post, and I don't have that power at the New York Times. Maybe I just don't like having. Maybe the headlines are fine. I just hate not having the power anymore. But you don't know what it is that's attracting readers, and so it's really hard to say, that like, oh, this article did better, quote unquote. So I'm going to write more things like that. I think that would not be a great conclusion to draw. I get all sorts of feedback from readers who have no reservations about emailing me and telling me when they think I wrote something, brilliant or something transcendentally stupid. And what is amazing about the Times, unlike the Washington Post, I would hear mainly from like a Washington-based audience. I hear people all over the world who are writing me to tell me what they think. And sometimes my articles post like at 1 a.m. East Coast time, if they think it'll be of interest to European audiences that are waking up. And so, I hear from everywhere. I've written about this particular idea I'm about to share, but I'm always a little disappointed when someone writes me and says, "Oh my God, yes, like that was amazing, that was brilliant, that's exactly right." I die a little bit inside when I get that kind of feedback, because chances are all I've done is reaffirm their priors, right? I've just scratched their itches. I haven't really changed their mind. I've just reaffirmed their views rather than confronted them in any way. I prefer, I joke that people say 100% when they're expressing agreement with something you say, like, oh yeah, 100%. And I'm always like, 100? Really? Like full, complete agreement? Like, what about like, I'll take 73%. Like that would be better, right? Because yeah, I mainly agree, but I have some differences, but no one says yes, 73%, right? Everyone says 100%. And I find that kind of mindless, right? That kind of mindless agreement. It just suggests that like you've expressed views that appeal to one team and not to another, right? And I can write, 100 articles about how one politician is doing something wrong, and then I write one article about how that politician's opponent might be doing something wrong. And then I get millions of messages saying like, oh my God, how could you say that? You're just defending this other guy. And it's like, have you read anything I've written ever, And so as much data as we have about the audience, it's still not the easiest thing in the world to wrap your arms around, which is why I say deceptively that I don't care about audience. I didn't exactly say I don't care. I said that I will trade away audience for freedom. I'd rather have the freedom to do the kind of journalism I want, even if it means for a smaller audience. I'm lucky that the Times has a massive audience. And just, it's not even sometimes what I write, just the power of the Times machinery, the Times website that just gets my stuff out there. But those are some of the ways that I try to think about the audience from time to time. I do look at all the data, I do slice and dice it, but in the end, the most important audience, aside from my first reader, is this an article that I'd want to read, right? Is it a subject that I'm interested in? And then that'll make it better, right? Instead of just like clout chasing, with what I think readers are interested in. Oh my God. No, somebody else. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for those insights. If people have obviously come knocking at your door, which means that you've built a network. How did you intentionally build a network, and how do you look for mentors, and how do mentors look for you, and mentees look for you?
Oh, yeah. Networks, again, network is, it's kind of when I think about the word building, right? Building a career. Networks are almost always accidental, right? Like, I think there's people who are very deliberate about networking. You know, they're like the super eager person coming up to you like, hey, sir, you know, like, and I find that the most, there was a here, the academics here, like there was a sociologist named Mark Granovetter from like forever ago, who wrote a famous article called The Strength of Weak Ties, right? And it was about how it was like those tenuous connections that would link unexpected, make unexpected networks were the most valuable. And so, like the way I was able to get a job at Foreign Policy Magazine is because when I still wanted to be a policy person, I did an internship at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. And my boss there, an economist named Nancy Birdsall, was friends/colleagues with an economist named Moises Naim from Venezuela, who ended up becoming the editor of Foreign Policy Magazine. And so I connected through Nancy, who was like a professional economist, not working in journalism at all. You know, I bank shot that to her friend, who then ended up running a magazine, who wanted someone with a background in economics, right? And so that's like, I never could have planned that kind of network. But Moises ended up being a mentor of mine for decades. He still is. Now we live close to each other, and I still see him. And he still gives me advice. There were a few years ago, I thought about moving to our alma mater, to Notre Dame, and teaching journalism there. And Moises talked me out of it. He felt that there was more I still had to do as a full-time journalist. And so I think of him as the most important professional mentor, but there's also just kind of human mentors. I think of my paternal grandfather as an important mentor, and just the way he lived his life, right? Which I think is probably more important than any professional mentor. People come to me all the time now, usually alums of schools I've attended, or people I meet at events like this, which is fine. Anyone wants to reach out to me, to ask for professional advice. The son of a neighbor of ours is a junior in high school, edits his student paper, sent me an email today if I would come talk to his journalism club in high school. I'm going to. He's a neighbor. And so that happens all the time. The way I try to make that consistent is, so I taught a class for Notre Dame's Washington semester program for about 12 years, and I work with those students who I've met over the years, very regularly. Mentorship can't be just like a one-off, like it's an ongoing relationship, and I've helped them apply to graduate school or, be a recommendation for jobs. When they go to law school, they put me as a reference for like a judge or an internship or a clerkship they're getting. But I've never been that deliberate about cultivating networks. It's almost like journalism. Just be curious, meet interesting people, talk to them. Not just because you think you're going to get something out of them, but just because they're interesting to you. When I think of people who've given me opportunities along the way. I just met them. We had some kind of chemistry, some kind of connection, and then they thought of me later on for something, or I thought of them later on for something.
Okay, I'm sure a journalist and writer of your age and experience and talent probably doesn't use AI.
Oh,
Have you ever been tempted to? Do you see a role for it in any way? I'm sure you fact check. I'm sure you look at a lot of stuff that's been written by AI. But
Yeah, no, I mean, I use it often in sort of small ways. Like, I've never been tempted to like have it like write an article for me. That is both out of some important principle, but also it's just not good enough yet to like write high-quality articles. Not that all my articles are high quality, but the articles that I would want to read. When I was a book critic at the Post, a friend of mine who was a book critic at the Times sent me an AI version of a book review on a book that we had both separately reviewed. This was a few years ago, like early on. It was Evicted by Matthew Desmond, if you guys have read that book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And it wasn't bad. You know, it wasn't bad. It sort of was serviceable. It was workable. I use it in small ways. Like, for instance, this morning, I'm working on something else that I'm writing, and I had read a book called How Democracies Die by Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky. And I remembered that there were two concepts that they highlighted as these two important norms that uphold democracy. And I knew that one was forbearance, right? Meaning that you don't, you may have certain powers, but you don't use them to the hilt. You don't use them all the way because, just because you can, right? Because you know that in a democracy, the other side may end up using those same powers to the hilt later on, and you don't want to do that. So you display institutional forbearance, right? But I couldn't remember the other one, right? And so my copy of How Democracies Die is sitting, you know, back in Bethesda, Maryland. And so I go into Gemini or whatever, you know, the Google AI, and I was like, what are the two principles that that Ziblatt and Levitsky write about in How Democracies Die? And it was like, oh, institutional forbearance and mutual toleration, right? So like, and that means that you think of your political opponents not in sort of existential terms, but as legitimate participants in the arena, right? And so, like in that sense, it's super useful in like a day-to-day way. It's like it's a faster Google search, right? But that said, there are, you know, teams at the Times who are thinking about like how to responsibly use this. I don't need to tell people in universities, you know, all the challenges that it poses about how you ensure that students are doing their own writing. You know, I understand Blue Books are making a comeback. As a result, that was how it was when I was a student. So I think initially there was this like, you know, sense of like, you know, this is bad, we can't use this. And now I think there's far more acceptance of like, okay, this is here to stay. How do we use it responsibly? I have dealt with it in my own work by using it super sparingly, by not even knowing enough to know all the things that I could be doing with it. Ignorance is never a good policy, and so I think it's not sustainable for me to take that approach. There are ways, even just all sorts of like data mining, all sorts of like, you know, sort of short of like full AI in the way we conceive of it now, have allowed journalists to do work that they never could have done before, to get through like massive quantities of data and information to find certain things. So I'll give you one example that I'm going to actually meet with someone at the Times about. You probably all heard about Project 2025, you know, this sort of controversial, you know, set of plans that that a conservative think tank put together before the 2024 election about how to govern. It's a 900-page book. It's super dense. It's hard to get through, but I wanted to, and so I spent like 6 weeks reading it, picking it apart, trying to find kind of big themes, and then writing a lengthy essay about it. The whole thing took me about 2 months to do, right? Is there a way that I could have, you know, ethically and responsibly used artificial intelligence to help me sift through that material faster, right? Or I always think like, what would have I missed if I had done that, right? Because part of the magic of AI is it makes things faster, but that's also what makes it suck, right? Because the great thing is like when you're slowly churning through material, you start making unexpected connections. You see things that can only come to you because you're going through that slow, arduous work. Wait, what he's saying on page 372 is different from what they said on page 172. And how do I go back? Well, okay, there's a footnote there. Okay, that raises a book. Let me go to the book. Let me do, you know, like, and going through that process ends up producing, I hope, something good that only I could have done at the end. So speed is wonderful. Speed is helpful, but speed kills sometimes that serendipity that you have when you're just churning through a lot of material because you have to, because there's no other way. But there's much smarter people than I am who are trying to figure this all out for the New York Times and for every other news organization.
Sir, the question I have for you was, and you don't have to tell me the most, but I just wanted to ask, is there ever been like something painful that, something that felt painful that you had to leave out when writing that you really wanted to have in, or?
Painful like personally, or just like I wanted that.
Something you really wanted to include.
And my editor made me cut it or something. Let me think about that. I can think of one thing, but it wasn't painful. It was actually helpful. So, God, this story's gonna be too long. I'm trying to think of how to keep it short. So at one point I was writing an article for the Times about the way that President Trump and members of his administration spoke about immigrants, right? And I went through kind of these key lines that had emerged over the years. Starting from like his very first speech during his campaign, like Mexico's not sending their best, right? That was the sort of a famous line. And so I was writing about each of these lines through my own experience of immigration and of kind of watching politics for a long time. But I was really uncomfortable with doing that because I didn't want anyone thinking that I was thinking that I'm speaking for the immigrant experience. Like every immigrant experience is so different and so unique and so idiosyncratic that like I don't speak for anyone but myself, right? I don't represent any community at all. I speak for me, right? No one's authorized me to speak for them, so I speak for me. And so I had this whole thing at the beginning of this article that basically said that like I hate it when people say like as a this, as a that, like no as-as, like no one's authorized you to speak for anyone else, just speak for yourself. But here in this case, I'm gonna do it because of X, Y, or Z, right? And my sister read it, my editor read it, the research assistant that I work with read it, and they all told me like, what are you doing? Like, why are you writing that? I'm like, because it's so important to me, because I believe that. And one of them says, like, you're just going to like turn off a huge audience at the beginning, wouldn't even want to read what you're saying. And then someone else told me something very smart, and I can't remember if it was you, if it was Adrian, who said, you know what, like, those first 3 paragraphs that you have, it sounds like something that you needed to go through in your own head to allow you to write this article, but you don't have to share that with all your readers. That's just like what you needed to give yourself permission to write this kind of article. So great, congratulations, you gave yourself permission. Now just write the article and skip that,
Gotcha.
right? And so in the end, I condensed those 3 paragraphs into like one sentence that went a little deeper into the article, not at the beginning. And so I was able to still kind of make my point. But all that to say is that it's rarely that I am forced to like lose something that I really, really wanted. It's usually that, in the course of an editing conversation, I figure out that there's a better way to express a thought, or that this thing I'm devoting a lot of attention to is not as important as something else. So, for instance, sometimes I win those fights, right? I wrote a piece very recently about how President Trump and members of the administration would often talk about the war in Iran as being, quote, ahead of schedule. And I was wondering, like, what does that mean? What does ahead of schedule mean? What schedules? There's a schedule for the war? I wasn't sure what they meant by that. And then I thought about Orwell's 1984 and how they said, we've always been at war with East Asia. Remember that famous line in 1984? And when, I can't remember who in the administration was saying, like, oh, we've been at war with Iran forever, like, actually they started the war. And so I made this little glancing reference to, we've always been at war with East Asia. In the piece, thinking enough people will have read 1984 that they'll get the reference and they'll like it. But the copy editor was like, wait, do you mean East Asia? Like 2 words? What are you talking about here? So the copy editor didn't get the reference. And I find that you have to have some things and pieces that will appeal to just a smaller audience, because then they feel like you're speaking just to them, and they feel smart because they get it. And then once they feel that way, then they're mine. You know, then they will want to read me again because they think I'm talking to them. And so I had a big back and forth with my editor, like, do we keep it, do we not keep it? And I really wanted to. And he's like, look, some people will not get it, but it really fits what you're trying to say, so screw it, just go for it, you know? And so what I think is important, the takeaway here is that there's a lot of conversation that goes into every little thing in a news story, in an opinion column. You know, it just seems like people just sit down and write, and that's the story. But everything is a decision, is a conversation, is a tussle sometimes. And that's part of to me, that's the most fun part of my job, is trying to think about and working with other people to realize what's the best way to express the thing I'm trying to express.
Because the issue I had was that I was just going to ask you, my bad, I just want to ask, I wanted to get your book, the Washington book, and I was just wondering, what was the message that you were trying to convey to the readers? That's why I was leading to that.
Well, I mean, I don't want to give it away. You should definitely buy it on Amazon, available in paperback. The message I was trying to convey there is that, you know, there's all these political memoirs that get a bad rap. People think they're just they're just propaganda, they're ghost-written, you know. But what I found is that politicians end up revealing themselves, because propaganda is revealing. What does propaganda tell you? It tells you how someone wants to be perceived. And it tells you what they think of you, what they think of the audience. They think, oh, this is going to appeal to people. So even when people are lying, they're revealing themselves. And that was sort of one of my overriding principles when I was writing that book.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed this. So I want to go back to the question of audience and creating the audience, your audience. Yeah. And what I've wondered about is what sometimes seems to me, not your writing, but in
everyone else,
other journalists' writings, a kind of conscious decision not to include certain people. Like, they're fine owning the libs, and they know they're being provocative, and they have an audience that they've created or that has found them, and they're happy with that. And I just wonder what sort of thinking or intellectual decision-making goes into sort of, I don't know, just sort of settling with that and imagining that is, I don't know, good, responsible, open, pluralistic journalism. When a reader knows that they're not being addressed, that they are actually being told that they're not welcome in this particular...
Meaning by, for instance, who is quoted in a piece, or who is... Oh, okay.
Sort of, I suppose, maybe this is political opinion writing, right? So you've sort of staked your claim to a certain terrain. Yeah. And you know that this is going to be provocative to a lot of people.
Oh, okay.
And you go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that provocation should neither be avoided nor deliberately courted, right? If it happens because you're trying to say something, express something that you feel is true and right and worth saying, then I don't really care who's provoked or who's not provoked. I think that I would say that most of the writers that I have worked with or I know don't necessarily think of it like, you know, who am I, you know, excluding, who am I speaking to, who am I not speaking to. I would guess that especially, and really you should sort of talk to each one of these. Like they see their work in different ways. Like Tom Friedman of the New York Times. Tom Friedman, you know, he goes around the world, you know, and then shares with readers like, you know, I went to China and I saw the future, and here's what it looks like, right? Ross Douthat, who's a conservative columnist of the New York Times, probably realizes that he's sort of behind enemy lines, right? And he is there to try to explain the right to the liberal readers of the New York Times, right? So he may write differently for the Times than he would say in National Review, where he does movie criticism, And so I think it's more about like how they see their mission sometimes, I think, than about like who am I gonna omit from this story or that column or that idea. Like we have two podcasters in New York Times Opinion. We have many, but like the two I'll mention, like Ezra Klein, who sees, again, I'm just surmising this from being a consumer of their work. I haven't talked to them about this, right? But like Ezra is here to help the left figure out how it deals with Trumpism. You know, Ross is there to kind of explain Trumpism to the left, you know, by interviewing people who might not otherwise get a hearing in other Times opinion columns, right? And so I think it's kind of how they see their broader mission at any given moment. That's if I understand, you know, where you're going with it. I think that's how people tend to see their jobs. You know, like what their project is, what their overall intellectual project is. I don't really know what mine is, and I really benefit from readers who tell me what my project is, right? And be like, oh, that's what I'm doing, right? Again, it's the rearview mirror. You know, like I try to write interesting columns each time out. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail. But it's only later that I look back and be like, oh, this is what this kind of body of work adds up to. We're cranking out so much that it's hard to kind of like see how everything fits into the jigsaw puzzle. The jigsaw puzzle comes at the end of your career.
Well, thank you so much, Carlos, for this wonderful presentation and also for sharing your experience with us. It's such an honor to have you and also your family with us today, as well as the entire audience that accompanied us today. On behalf of the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, we have a little token of appreciation for you.
Thank you so much.
One more time, a big a round of applause for Carlos. Yeah. We appreciate your time, and we just wanted to let you know that we're here to answer any questions from our office. We'll be in the lobby. There is also additional refreshments in there. If you would like to connect with Carlos, he will be here also for a few more minutes. But thank you so much for coming in today, for being part of this year New York Times Speakers Series. And it was such an honor to have you with us. Thank you so much, Carlos.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. Gracias.